It was 2:14 p.m. on September 16, 1966, and the light over the Dnieper River in Kiev was beginning to fracture through a heavy industrial haze. On the pedestrian walkway of the Patton Bridge, a 32-year-old American architecture professor named Thomas Spencer paused to adjust the aperture on his Kodak Retina 3C. To Spencer, the scene was a study in mid-century structural engineering. The welding joints, the rhythmic lattice of steel against the gray Ukrainian sky, the way the Soviet industrial aesthetic clashed with the natural curve of the riverbank. He was halfway through a 3-week tour of the Soviet Union, a trip organized through the state-run Intourist agency, intended to be a cultural exchange that would broaden his academic portfolio. He checked his light meter, framed the shot to include a passing steam locomotive on the parallel railway track, and pressed the shutter release. That mechanical click, a sound no louder than a snapping twig, was the precise moment Thomas Spencer ceased to be a tourist and became a subject of the Committee for State Security. He did not know it yet. He wound the film advance lever, satisfied with the composition, and turned to walk back toward the embankment where his tour group was waiting. He took 3 steps before a black Volga GZ-21, which had been idling near the bridge's entrance, rolled forward to cut off his path. 2 men in ill-fitting gray raincoats stepped out. They did not introduce themselves. They did not ask for his passport. One simply reached out and took the camera from Spencer's neck, snapping the leather strap in the process, while the other gripped his elbow with a force that suggested this was not a conversation, but an extraction. To understand the gravity of that shutter click, one must first understand the invisible landscape Spencer had just stepped into. By the mid-1960s, the Soviet Union was not merely a country. It was a fortress state operating under a siege mentality that had calcified into law. The Cold War had moved from the frantic fluidity of the immediate post-war years into a deep, structural paranoia. The KGB, under the chairmanship of Vladimir Semichastny, and soon to be led by Yuri Andropov, had refined the definition of espionage to include almost any unauthorized observation of state infrastructure. For a Western tourist, the rules of photography were printed on the back of in-tourist maps in small, dense Cyrillic and English text, often ignored or misunderstood. Photographs of military installations, seaports, hydroelectric stations, radio beacons, and bridges were strictly forbidden. But the definition of strategic was fluid, expanding and contracting based on the political climate of the week. A bridge was not just a bridge, it was a logistical artery for the Red Army. A train was not just transportation, it was state capacity. To photograph them was not an artistic choice. In the eyes of the counterintelligence directorates, it was an act of topographical reconnaissance. Spencer, standing on that bridge in a tweed jacket and holding a map of Kiev, believed he was capturing the aesthetic of socialist realism. The men shoving him into the back of the Volga believed he was documenting the structural vulnerabilities of the Patton Bridge for the Central Intelligence Agency. This dissonance between the innocent intent of the individual and the hyper-vigilant interpretation of the state was the defining mechanism of the Soviet tourist experience. It was a trap waiting to be sprung, and Spencer had just walked into it. The drive to the local KGB headquarters on Vladimirskaya Street took less than 15 minutes. Spencer sat sandwiched between the 2 officers, the smell of stale Belomorkanal tobacco and damp wool filling the cabin. He tried to speak, asking in broken Russian where they were going, but the silence was absolute. This was a standard psychological tactic, the removal of information. By denying the prisoner any context, the state forced the prisoner's mind to fill the void with its own worst fears. Spencer's heart rate climbed. He replayed the last hour in his head, scanning for errors. Had he jaywalked? Had he lost his visa papers? The camera sat on the dashboard, a mute piece of evidence that he still didn't realize was the smoking gun. When they arrived, he was not taken to a standard police holding cell, but to an interrogation room in the basement of the majestic, terrifying building that served as the nerve center for Ukrainian state security. The room was painted a glossy, institutional green halfway up the walls, with yellowing plaster above. There was a table bolted to the floor, 2 chairs, and a portrait of Lenin hanging slightly askew. For the first 4 hours, Spencer sat alone. This was the marinating period. The KGB knew that an American, accustomed to efficiency and rights, would begin to unravel when faced with bureaucratic nothingness. Spencer paced the small room. He checked his watch until they came in and took it. He asked for water and received none. The reality of his situation began to set in, not as a sharp shock, but as a slow, suffocating pressure. He was thousands of miles from home, in a city where he knew no one, held by an organization that answered to no external oversight. At 6 p.m., a new figure entered the room. Major Valery Volkov was a man of cultivated grayness. Gray eyes, gray suit, gray complexion. He carried a file folder and Spencer's camera. He sat down, placed the camera in the center of the table, and lit a cigarette. "Mr. Spencer," Volkov said, his English accented but precise. "Who is your handler?" Spencer blinked, the question so absurd he almost laughed. "My handler? I'm a professor. I teach at the University of Michigan. I'm a tourist." Volkov opened the file. "We have developed the film. Frame 14, the bridge. Frame 15, the railway line. Frame 16, the locomotive. These are strategic objects. Why are you documenting the transport logistics of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic?" "I like trains," Spencer stammered. "I'm an architect. I was photographing the truss work on the bridge." "The truss work," Volkov repeated, tasting the word as if it were a lie. "You are an expert in structures. You know where the stress points are. You know where a charge must be placed to drop the span into the river. That is why you took the photo." This was the inflection point. Spencer realized with a jolt of cold terror that they were not looking for a confession of a mistake. They were building a narrative of espionage. In the Soviet legal system, intent was secondary to effect. The effect of his photo was the recording of a strategic site. Therefore, the intent must be malicious. The logic was circular and impenetrable. For the next 3 weeks, Thomas Spencer disappeared from the surface of the earth. He was transferred to the KGB investigation prison in Kiev, a facility designed to break the will without leaving marks. The routine was designed to dismantle his identity. He was stripped of his clothes and given a coarse cotton uniform. His name was replaced by a number, though the guards simply called him Americanets. The lights in his cell were kept on 24 hours a day, a high-wattage bulb protected by a wire mesh that burned into his retinas even when he closed his eyes. Sleep was regulated. He was forbidden from lying down between 6 a.m. and 10 p.m. If he nodded off while sitting on the edge of his cot, a guard would bang on the metal door with a truncheon. The interrogation sessions happened at night, usually beginning at 2 a.m., disrupting his circadian rhythms until day and night merged into a single gray continuum of exhaustion. The interrogations were not physically violent in the Hollywood sense. There were no beatings, no electrodes. The violence was intellectual and bureaucratic. Volkov and a rotating team of investigators drilled into every aspect of Spencer's life. They demanded he list every person he had ever met who worked for the U.S. government. They asked about his university funding. Did it come from defense grants? They analyzed his library records, his travel history, his membership in the American Institute of Architects. They were constructing a legend for him, a spy persona that fit their evidence. The fact that Spencer had no intelligence training made him, in their eyes, a deep cover asset or a useful idiot utilized by the CIA for low-level reconnaissance. They presented him with the developed photos, blown up to grainy 8x10s. They pointed to shadows and blurs, interpreting them as coded signals. "You see here," Volkov would say, pointing to a pedestrian in the background of a shot of St. Sophia's Cathedral. "This man. You were signaling him." "I don't know who that is," Spencer would weep, his resistance eroding under the weight of sleep deprivation. "It's just a man walking. It is a contact," Volkov would insist, writing it down in the protocol. Subject refuses to identify contact. Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, a slow-motion diplomatic crisis was unfolding. Spencer's failure to return to his hotel had triggered an alert with the in-tourist guide, who, bound by protocol, reported it to the militia. The militia, seeing the KGB involvement, sealed the file. It took 4 days for the U.S. Embassy in Moscow to be notified that an American citizen had been detained. The consular officer, a weary veteran of Soviet obstructionism named Richard Davies, immediately flew to Kiev. He was granted a meeting with Spencer only after 10 days of stonewalling. The meeting took place in a specially prepared room at the prison, with a KGB monitor present to ensure they did not discuss the substance of the investigation. When Davies saw Spencer, he was shocked. The professor had lost 20 pounds. His skin was pasty, his hands trembled, and his eyes darted around the room. "They think I'm a spy, Dick," Spencer whispered, leaning across the table. "They think the bridge photo was for the Pentagon." "Listen to me, Tom," Davies said, keeping his voice level. "We are lodging protests at the highest level. The State Department is involved. Do not sign anything you don't understand. Do not agree to any translation that isn't yours." But the advice was hard to follow in the isolation of the cell. The KGB presented Spencer with protocols written in Russian, with verbal translations provided by an interpreter who seemed to gloss over nuances. They told him that if he signed a confession admitting to violation of Article 70, anti-Soviet agitation and propaganda, he would be expelled immediately. If he continued to deny it, he would be charged with espionage under Article 65, which carried the death penalty. It was a classic prisoner's dilemma engineered by the state. Admit to a lesser crime to escape the greater one, or stand on the truth and risk execution. Spencer, exhausted, terrified, and desperate to see his wife and daughter again, began to waver. He started to wonder if maybe he had been reckless. Maybe he was guilty of arrogance. The system was rewriting his own memory. On October 24th, 5 weeks after his arrest, Spencer signed a document admitting to hostile observation of Soviet reality and gross violation of administrative regulations regarding photography. He believed this was his ticket home. He was wrong. The confession was not an exit visa. It was the closing argument for the prosecution. The Soviet legal system did not operate on the presumption of innocence, but on the presumption of state infallibility. Once the confession was signed, the machine moved to the sentencing phase. The trial was a closed-door affair, held in a military tribunal room. There was no jury. The judge was a military officer. The defense attorney assigned to Spencer was a state employee whose job was not to argue for acquittal, but to plead for leniency based on the prisoner's repentance. The proceedings lasted 6 hours. The prosecutor painted Spencer not as a mastermind, but as a symbol of Western insolence. A man who thought he could come into the Soviet home and steal its secrets with a Kodak lens. The verdict was delivered swiftly. 3 years in a corrective labor colony, general regime. The charge had been downgraded from espionage to malicious hooliganism and violation of travel regulations, but the sentence was real. Spencer was transferred to a camp in the Mordovian ASSR, a region of forests and swamps southeast of Moscow that had served as the archipelago of the Gulag for decades. The camp, Potma, was a collection of wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers. It was here that the American professor entered the true heart of the Soviet experience. He was no longer a tourist or a suspect. He was a Zek. He was issued a padded jacket, telegraika, felt boots, and a spoon. His head was shaved. He was assigned to a work brigade manufacturing wooden crates for industrial machinery. The work was mindless and physically demanding, performed in unheated workshops where the temperature often dropped below freezing. The camp population was a mixture of genuine criminals, thieves, murderers, and political prisoners. Spencer found himself bunking with a Ukrainian nationalist poet, a Baptist minister arrested for illegal preaching, and a former Red Army captain who had told a joke about Brezhnev. In this strange ecosystem, Spencer was a curiosity. The Amerikanets became a sort of mascot for the politicals. They shared their meager rations with him, taught him the slang of the camps, and explained the unwritten rules of survival. Never trust the guards, never volunteer, and never look at the calendar. For Spencer, the psychological toll was heavier than the physical one. It was the loss of agency. In Michigan, his life was defined by choices: what to teach, what to read, where to go. In Potma, he had no choices. He was a unit of labor. He learned to hoard bread crusts. He learned to wrap his feet in rags to prevent frostbite. He learned that the sky in Mordovia was a different color than the sky in the rest of the world, a permanent, oppressive white. Back in Washington, the Spencer case had become a minor but persistent irritant in U.S.-Soviet relations. It was the era of détente's infancy, and neither side wanted a single tourist to derail broader nuclear talks. However, the Soviets needed to save face. They couldn't simply release a convicted criminal without getting something in return. It became a game of diplomatic barter. The negotiations took place in hushed rooms in Geneva and Washington. The Soviets hinted they might release Spencer as a humanitarian gesture if the U.S. agreed to overlook the expulsion of a Soviet trade attaché caught buying industrial blueprints in Chicago. It was a transaction of human currency. In the camp, Spencer knew nothing of this. He marked the days by the depth of the snow. He contracted dysentery and spent 2 weeks in the camp infirmary, a place where aspirin was the only medicine and the stench of bleach couldn't mask the smell of decay. He began to hallucinate, having long conversations with his wife in the dark of the barracks. He worried he was going insane. Then, on a Tuesday in February 1968, 17 months into his sentence, a guard called his number. "Get your things." He was transported back to Moscow, not in a prisoner train, but in a heated van. He was taken to Lefortovo prison, given a hot shower, a clean suit that was 2 sizes too big, and a heavy meal of meat and potatoes. The sudden shift in treatment was disorienting, a form of gaslighting on a state scale. The next morning, he was driven to Sheremetyevo Airport. He was escorted not to the terminal, but to the tarmac. Standing by the stairs of a Pan Am flight was Richard Davies from the embassy and 2 KGB officers. Major Volkov was there. He looked exactly the same as he had in the interrogation room. Gray, impassive, smelling of tobacco. He handed Spencer his passport. "You are being expelled from the Soviet Union," Volkov said, as if Spencer were an unruly guest being asked to leave a party. "Do not return." Spencer didn't speak. He couldn't. He climbed the stairs to the plane, his legs feeling heavy and uncoordinated. When he stepped through the cabin door and saw the American stewardess, the familiar logo, the rows of seats, he collapsed. He didn't faint. His legs simply gave out under the weight of the transition. The flight home was a blur of debriefings. CIA officers met the plane in London. They wanted to know everything, not about the bridge, but about the camp. Who was there? What were the names of the other prisoners? What was the layout of the barracks? Spencer, the man who had been arrested for taking a photo, was now being mined for mental snapshots of the Soviet penal system. He returned to Michigan a changed man. The physical scars healed, the frostbite on his toes, the digestive issues from the dysentery, but the internal architecture of his mind had been rearranged. He found he couldn't photograph anything anymore. The act of looking through a viewfinder induced a panic attack, a visceral memory of the click that ended his life as he knew it. He resumed teaching, but his lectures on structure changed. He spoke less about aesthetics and more about the oppressive nature of brutalism, about how buildings could control and intimidate. He became obsessed with the visibility of power. The camera, the Kodak Retina through IC, was never returned. It remained in a file in the KGB archives in Kiev, tagged as Evidence Item 492. The film was never developed for the public. The photo of the bridge, the steam locomotive, the gray sky, it existed only in the classified dossier, a captured moment of time that the state had seized and buried. Years later, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the archives were partially opened. Researchers found Spencer's file. It contained the interrogation protocols, the signed confession, and the incriminating photographs. Looking at them with the distance of history, the tragedy was farcical. The photo was blurry. The train was barely visible. The bridge was just a bridge. There was no strategic value, no secret code. It was just a bad picture taken by a tourist on a cloudy day. But the file also revealed the internal logic of the system. In the margins of the reports, officers had noted that Spencer seemed genuinely naive, yet they proceeded with the prosecution because the quota for vigilance had to be met. The system required spies to justify its own existence. If it couldn't find real ones, it had to manufacture them from the raw material of innocent mistakes. Thomas Spencer's story serves as a grim autopsy of the Cold War's psychological landscape. It demonstrates how the total state politicizes the very act of seeing. In a world defined by secrecy, there is no such thing as a neutral observer. Every gaze is an act of espionage, every camera a weapon, and every tourist a potential prisoner of a war they didn't know they were fighting. The legacy of that September afternoon on the Patton Bridge is not about the intelligence value of a photograph. It is about the fragility of freedom when it crosses a border into a jurisdiction of paranoia. It reminds us that the Iron Curtain was not just a physical barrier of minefields and barbed wire. It was a cognitive distortion field where a shutter click could echo like a gunshot, and a man could lose 2 years of his life for trying to capture a fleeting moment of light on a river. To fully grasp the machinery that ensnared Thomas Spencer, we must zoom out from the personal nightmare of the cell and examine the vast, interconnected apparatus of Soviet counterintelligence that operated beneath the surface of everyday life in the 1960s. This was not a monolithic entity, but a sprawling bureaucracy of directorates, departments, and local field offices, all competing for prestige and results. The KGB's second chief directorate, responsible for internal security and counterintelligence, was the primary architect of Spencer's ordeal. Within this directorate, the 7th Department specialized in surveillance. The Watchers. These were the men in the gray Volga, the invisible pedestrians, the women sitting on park benches reading newspapers that never turned a page. They were trained in the art of external observation, naruzhnoye nablюдение. For a foreigner in the USSR, surveillance was a tiered system. A high-value target, like a diplomat or a known intelligence officer, would have a dedicated team of followers operating in shifts, using cars, radios, and elaborate hand signals. A low-value target, like a tourist, was subject to spot checks and the vigilance of the general population. This was the genius of the Soviet system. It deputized every citizen. The in-tourist guides, the hotel concierges, the taxi drivers, they were all part of the sensory network of the state. Spencer's guide, a young woman named Elena, had likely not wanted to report him, but she knew that she too was being watched. If she failed to report a client who wandered off or took suspicious photos, she could lose her job, her travel privileges, or worse. The system functioned on a cascade of fear. The fear of the guide fed the files of the local KGB, which fed the quotas of the regional officers, which justified the budgets of the central planners in Moscow. When Spencer raised his camera, he wasn't just breaking a rule. He was triggering a tripwire in this vast mesh. The reaction was disproportionate because the system was designed to overreact. It was better to arrest 10 innocent tourists than to let one spy escape. This statistical cruelty was baked into the operational doctrine. Let us return to the interrogation room, to the granular texture of the psychological siege Spencer endured. The KGB manuals of the era, later declassified, reveal a sophisticated understanding of human psychology. The goal of interrogation was not always to extract truth, but to align the subject's reality with the state's narrative. Major Volkov employed a technique known as the conveyor. While not the physical torture of the Stalinist era, it was a relentless assembly line of questioning. One interrogator would work a 4-hour shift, then be replaced by a fresh one, while the prisoner remained. They would ask the same questions over and over, looking for microscopic deviations in the answers. Tell us again about the camera settings. Why f8? Why not f11? Who told you to use f8? To a rational mind, these questions are nonsense. To a mind deprived of sleep and sensory input, they become monstrous riddles. Spencer began to doubt his own memory. Did he use f8? Maybe he did use f11. Why did he choose that moment? Was it really the light? Or was it a subconscious signal he had been programmed to send? The KGB exploited the Western desire for resolution. Americans, culturally, are problem solvers. When faced with a conflict, they want to negotiate, to find a middle ground, to fix it. Spencer tried to help the interrogators understand. He tried to explain the principles of photography, the history of architecture. He thought if he just provided enough context, they would see their mistake. But every piece of information he offered was weaponized. When he mentioned he had once attended a lecture by an architect who had designed government buildings, it went into the file as links to U.S. government infrastructure specialists. When he mentioned he spoke a little German, it became proficiency in operational languages. The more he talked, the tighter the net became. The turning point, the signing of the confession, is often the most misunderstood part of such ordeals. It is rarely a moment of cowardice. It is a moment of biological collapse. The brain, starved of REM sleep and flooded with cortisol, simply seeks the path of least resistance to end the immediate stimulus of the interrogation. Spencer signed not because he believed he was guilty, but because signing was the only way to make the questions stop. The document he signed was a masterpiece of legal fiction. It did not say, "I am a spy." It said, "I admit that my actions could be interpreted as detrimental to the security of the Soviet state, and I regret the misuse of my photographic equipment in a sensitive zone." It was vague enough to be palatable to Spencer, but specific enough to secure a conviction under Article 70. Once the legal formalities were concluded, the transfer to the camp system introduced Spencer to a different kind of Soviet reality, the economic one. The gulag, even in the post-Stalin thaw, was a massive economic engine. The camps produced timber, furniture, auto parts, and uniforms. Spencer's labor in the crate factory was not just punishment, it was production. He worked alongside men who were the wreckage of Soviet history. There was Ivan, a former partisan who had fought the Nazis, but was arrested in 1948 for praising American trucks. There was Lev, a Jewish mathematician denied university tenure, who had written a letter of protest to the Central Committee. These men became Spencer's tutors. They taught him the camp walk, hands behind the back, head down, shuffling to conserve energy. They taught him how to sew a hidden pocket into the lining of his jacket to hide a crust of bread. They taught him the most important lesson of all, how to live entirely in the present. To think of the past was painful. To think of the future was impossible. There was only the current hour, the current quota, the current bowl of soup. Spencer's survival was also due to his status as a foreigner. The camp administration was terrified of him dying in custody. A dead American was a diplomatic incident. A live prisoner was a bargaining chip. So while he was worked hard, he was spared the worst of the disciplinary cells, the freezing stone boxes where prisoners were sent for minor infractions. He received packages from the embassy, chocolate, vitamins, warm socks, which he shared with his brigade, elevating his status to that of a provider. This microeconomy of the camp mirrored the larger black market of the Soviet Union. A pair of American wool socks could buy a week's worth of sugar. A bar of chocolate could bribe a guard to look the other way during a search. Spencer learned that corruption was the grease that kept the rusty gears of the system turning. The diplomatic channel that eventually freed him was equally complex. The Cold War was a game of symmetry. If the Americans arrested a Soviet spy, the Soviets needed an American spy. But real American spies were hard to catch. They operated under diplomatic cover or deep illegality. Tourists like Spencer were the low-hanging fruit. They were the reserves of the spy trade. The negotiations for his release involved the highest levels of the State Department. Henry Kissinger, then rising in influence, was briefed on the Spencer problem. The strategy was delicate. To demand his release too loudly would inflate his value and make the Soviets hold him tighter. To ignore him would be a domestic political liability. The solution was the quiet trade. The Soviet attaché in Chicago, a man named Petrov, had been caught dead to rights purchasing blueprints for a new type of industrial valve. The FBI had him. The deal was never written down, but the understanding was clear. We send Petrov home quietly, you send Spencer home quietly. No press conferences, no victory laps. This transactional nature of justice is what haunted Spencer most in the years that followed. He realized his freedom had nothing to do with his innocence. It was simply a matter of the exchange rate. He was worth one Petrov. When he returned to the United States, the adjustment was brutal. The colors of the American supermarket were too bright. The choices were too many. He found himself standing in the cereal aisle, paralyzed by the abundance, weeping silently. It is a common symptom of former hostages and prisoners of totalitarian systems, the freedom shock. He also faced a subtle suspicion at home. In the paranoid atmosphere of the late 60s, some colleagues wondered, why was he released early? Did he turn? Did the KGB recruit him? The stain of the accusation lingered. He had to undergo debriefings by the FBI, who were just as thorough, if less coercive, than the KGB. They wanted to know if he had been approached to work for Moscow. They asked him to sign non-disclosure agreements about the specifics of the trade. Spencer retreated into his work, but his architectural philosophy darkened. He began to write about panopticon structures, buildings designed to observe their inhabitants. He saw the Soviet Union not as a foreign land, but as the ultimate expression of a universal tendency toward control. He saw the seeds of it in American corporate parks, in the layout of suburbs, in the surveillance cameras that were beginning to appear in banks. The photograph of the bridge remained the ghost in the machine. It is fascinating to consider the counterfactuals. What if he had taken the photo 5 seconds later, after the train had passed? What if the sun had been in his eyes and he hadn't taken it at all? What if the Volga had been stuck in traffic? The randomness of the event is what makes it so terrifying. It strips away the illusion of agency. We like to believe that if we follow the rules, if we are good people, we will be safe. Spencer's story proves that in a system of total suspicion, safety is a statistical anomaly, not a right. The Cold War is often remembered as a clash of ideologies, of capitalism versus communism. But on the ground, for people like Thomas Spencer, it was a clash of bureaucracies. It was a war of paperwork, of rubber stamps, of quotas and protocols. It was a war where a man could be crushed not by a tank, but by a filing cabinet. As we reflect on this case from the vantage point of the 21st century, the parallels are unsettling. We live in an era of digital surveillance that would make Major Volkov weep with envy. We carry cameras everywhere. We document everything. We upload our coordinates, our faces, our networks to the cloud. The definition of strategic object has shifted from bridges to data centers, but the vulnerability remains. Spencer's ordeal was analog: film, paper, bars. Ours is digital, but the core dynamic is the same. The tension between the observer and the observed, the individual and the state, the innocent act and the suspicious interpretation. In the end, Thomas Spencer died in 1994, 3 years after the Soviet Union ceased to exist. He never went back to Russia, but in his study, he kept a small wooden box he had made in the camp at Potma. It was rough-hewn, sanded smooth with a piece of broken glass. Inside, he kept the broken strap of his camera, which the KGB had returned to him in a bag of personal effects. It was a memento mori of his lost years, a reminder of the day the shutter clicked and the world closed in. The dossiers of the KGB officers who interrogated him, Volkov and the others, reveal that they too were prisoners of the system. Volkov was eventually purged in a departmental shakeup in the mid-70s, forced into early retirement for lack of vigilance in another case. The system ate its own. The interrogator and the interrogated were bound together in a dance of mutual destruction, choreographed by a state that feared its own shadow. This is the true horror of the Spencer case. It was not an aberration. It was the system working exactly as designed. It was a machine built to consume trust and produce fear. And for 17 months, Thomas Spencer was fuel for that machine. To reconstruct the daily reality of Spencer's imprisonment is to descend into a world of sensory minimalism. The KGB investigation prison at 33 Vladimirskaya Street in Kiev was an acoustic tomb. The corridors were carpeted to muffle the footsteps of the guards. The doors were heavy steel with feeding slots that opened with a silent, oiled slide. Spencer's cell, number 42, measured 6 paces by 4. The walls were painted a glossy, nauseating green that seemed to sweat in the humidity of the Ukrainian summer and radiate cold in the winter. There was a slop bucket in the corner, a metal cot bolted to the wall, and a small table. No books, no paper, no pencils. The deprivation of sensory input was a deliberate technique to induce regression. Without external stimuli, the adult mind begins to dismantle itself. Spencer found himself obsessing over childhood memories, the pattern of the wallpaper in his grandmother's house, the smell of a specific bakery in Ann Arbor. These memories became more real than the stone walls around him. He developed a relationship with a spider that lived in the upper corner of the cell near the ventilation grate. He named it Boris. He would watch Boris for hours, marveling at the creature's freedom to move, to spin, to exist without a file number. When a guard eventually swept the web away during a routine search, Spencer felt a grief so profound he wept for hours. The food was calculated to sustain life, but deny pleasure. Breakfast was kipyatok, boiling water, and a ration of black bread, sour, damp, and heavy like clay. Lunch was a watery soup made from fish heads or cabbage, sometimes with a few grains of barley. Dinner was a spoonful of kasha, buckwheat porridge. The caloric intake was just enough to keep the prisoner conscious for interrogation, but low enough to keep them weak and docile. Hunger became a constant, dull ache. It sharpened the senses in strange ways. Spencer could smell the interrogator's cologne from down the hall. He could hear the scratch of a match being struck 3 cells away. The interrogations themselves evolved over time. After the initial conveyor phase, they shifted to a more conversational, almost intimate tone. Major Volkov would sometimes bring tea. He would ask Spencer about American literature, about Hemingway and Steinbeck. He would ask about jazz. "You see, Thomas," Volkov would say, using his first name now, "we are not barbarians. We appreciate culture. But culture must serve the people. Your photography, it serves only yourself. It is selfish. And in our country, selfishness is a crime." This was the ideological seduction. Volkov was trying to get Spencer to agree with the premise of his own guilt. If Spencer could be made to admit that his actions were arrogant or insensitive, it was a short step to admitting they were criminal. Spencer fought this with the only weapon he had, his architect's logic. He would argue about perspective, about the objective nature of a lens. "A camera has no politics, Major. It just records light." "Light is political," Volkov would retort. "What you choose to illuminate and what you choose to leave in the dark. That is politics." These philosophical debates in the basement of a KGB prison capture the surreal intellectualism of the Cold War. It wasn't just a battle over territory. It was a battle over the nature of reality itself. The transition to the labor camp in Mordovia was a physical shock that nearly killed him. The transport train, the Stolypin car, was a nightmare of overcrowding. Prisoners were packed into cages, standing room only, for a journey that took 3 days. There was no sanitation, little water, and the constant threat of violence from the Urkas, the professional criminals who ruled the prisoner hierarchy. When Spencer arrived at Potma, it was minus 20 degrees Celsius. The wind howled across the flat, frozen marshland. The camp was a gray smudge against the white snow. Here, the surveillance was different. It wasn't the hidden microphone or the telephoto lens. It was the stukash, snitch. The camp was riddled with informers. A prisoner could trade a piece of information, who was complaining about the norms, who was hiding bread for a lighter work detail or a new pair of boots. Spencer learned to speak in a code of his own. He never discussed politics. He never discussed America. He talked only about the work, the crates, the wood, the saw. He became a master of the banal. Yet even in this frozen hell, there were moments of profound humanity. The Ukrainian poet, whose name was Vasil, recited verses in the dark of the barracks after lights out. He didn't speak English well, and Spencer's Russian was rudimentary, but the rhythm of the poetry transcended language. It was a reminder that the human spirit could not be entirely, completely bureaucratized. One Christmas, the prisoners managed to smuggle in a small spruce branch from the forest. They decorated it with scraps of tin foil from cigarette packs and bits of colored thread pulled from their rags. They huddled around it in the corner of the barracks, whispering carols so the guards wouldn't hear. For a few minutes, the camp dissolved. They were just men, cold and hungry, holding on to a fragment of civilization. Spencer often thought about that moment later in his life. He realized that resistance wasn't always about fighting back or escaping. Sometimes resistance was just preserving a small pocket of dignity where the state couldn't reach. The release process was its own form of psychological torture. He was not told he was going home until he was at the airport. Up until the moment he saw the Pan Am plane, he thought he might be being transferred to a worse camp, or perhaps to a psychiatric hospital, a common fate for difficult dissidents. The psychiatric hospital, or psikhushka, was the ultimate weapon of the late Soviet state. If a prisoner refused to accept the state's logic, they were often declared insane. After all, in a worker's paradise, only a madman would oppose the system. Spencer had lived in fear of this. He had disciplined his mind to appear relentlessly, boringly sane. When he sat in the seat of the Pan Am jet, gripping the armrests until his knuckles turned white, he didn't feel joy. He felt a terrible, hollowing exhaustion. The adrenaline that had sustained him for 17 months suddenly evaporated, leaving him empty. The stewardess offered him a drink. "Coca-Cola?" she asked. The familiar red can, the hiss of the tab, the bubbles. It was a sensory overload. He took a sip and vomited. His body, adapted to the camp diet of gruel and black bread, rejected the sugar and carbonation. It was a physical rejection of the West, a sign of how deeply the gulag had rewritten his biology. The legacy of the Spencer case rippled through the intelligence communities of both nations. For the KGB, it was a Pyrrhic victory. They had caught a spy, but the diplomatic cost had been high, and the intelligence yield was zero. It led to internal reviews and a slight recalibration of how tourists were handled. The vigilance remained, but the threshold for arrest was raised slightly. They wanted fewer headaches. For the CIA and the State Department, it was a lesson in the limits of power. They could destroy the world with nuclear weapons, but they couldn't get a physics teacher out of a jail in Kiev. It reinforced the need for back-channel communications, for the shadowy networks of fixers and intermediaries who could grease the wheels of diplomacy when the official machinery jammed. For the public, the story was a brief sensation, then forgotten. It became just another anecdote of the Cold War, a cautionary tale told to travelers. Don't take photos of bridges. But for Thomas Spencer, it was the defining event of his existence. He lived the rest of his life with a dual consciousness. Part of him was the professor in Michigan, mowing his lawn, grading papers, paying taxes. But another part of him was always back in cell 42, listening to the silence, waiting for the slot to slide open. He wrote a memoir in the late 1970s, but it was never published. Publishers found it too dry, too detailed. They wanted cloak and dagger drama, car chases, romance. Spencer's story was about boredom, hunger, and the terrifying banality of evil. It didn't fit the genre expectations. The manuscript remains in his family's possession. It is a meticulous document, written with the precision of an architect. It maps the dimensions of the cell, the calorie count of the soup, the exact wording of the interrogation protocols. It is a blueprint of a stolen life. In the final analysis, the story of the American tourist and the wrong photograph is a study in the asymmetry of the Cold War. The West fought with money, technology, and media. The East fought with time, silence, and the infinite patience of a police state. Spencer was caught in the gears where these two worlds ground against each other. He was a grain of sand that didn't stop the machine, but was crushed by it. His experience stands as a monument to the victims of the gray zone, the people who were neither spies nor soldiers, but who nonetheless became casualties of the long, silent war. The bridge in Kiev still stands. The steam locomotives are gone, replaced by electric trains. The Soviet Union is a memory. But the shadow it cast, the suspicion, the fear, the power of the state to define reality, lingers in the DNA of the modern world. And somewhere in a dusty archive, frame 14 of a roll of Kodak film sits in a folder, slowly fading, a testament to the day a picture was worth not 1,000 words, but 17 months of a man's life. The mechanics of the exchange that freed Spencer deserve a closer look, as they reveal the cold calculus of Cold War diplomacy. The Soviet attaché, Petrov, was not a high-level mastermind. He was a mid-level functionary who had gotten greedy. The FBI had turned him, or tried to, and when he refused to fully cooperate, they prepared to prosecute. The KGB resident in Washington knew that a public trial of Petrov would be embarrassing. It would reveal the clumsiness of their industrial espionage efforts. They needed him back, and they needed the story buried. Spencer was the perfect counterweight. He was innocent, which meant he had no intelligence value to the U.S., but he was an American citizen, which meant the U.S. government had a political obligation to retrieve him. The asymmetry was the key. The Soviets traded a guilty spy for an innocent tourist. This type of exchange became a grim standard. The Soviets learned that they could bank hostages by arresting Westerners on technicalities, holding them in reserve for when one of their own was caught. It was a policy of human inventory. Richard Davies, the consular officer, later wrote in a classified cable, "We are trading apples for hostages. We are incentivizing the arrest of our own citizens." But the logic of the state overrode the logic of morality. Getting Spencer home was the priority. The precedent it set was a problem for tomorrow. When Spencer's plane landed in Detroit, there was no band, no crowd. Just his wife, Margaret, standing by the gate looking 5 years older than when he had left. They hugged awkwardly. The physical intimacy felt strange to him after so long in the tactile desert of the camp. He had trouble sleeping in a bed. It was too soft. For the first month, he slept on the floor of the living room, wrapped in a blanket. He hoarded food, hiding granola bars in his pockets, a habit that took years to break. He never touched a camera again. The device that had been his tool for seeing the world had become a symbol of his blindness to the danger around him. He gave his collection of lenses to a student. In his architecture classes, he began to focus on the concept of hostile architecture, design elements intended to control behavior. He spoke about how the Soviet cities were designed to prevent congregation, to create clear lines of fire, to make the individual feel small. He used his memory of Kiev and Moscow not as travelogue, but as forensic evidence. His students found him intense, a bit strange. They didn't know that when he looked at a blueprint, he wasn't seeing walls and windows. He was seeing containment and observation. The story of Thomas Spencer is a reminder that history is not just made by great leaders and generals. It is made by the collision of ordinary lives with extraordinary systems. It is made in the quiet, terrifying moments when the rules of the world suddenly change, and a tourist on a bridge becomes a prisoner of the state. It is a story that demands we look closer at the systems we live in, at the invisible lines we cross every day. It asks us to consider what strategic objects we might be photographing, what data we might be leaking, what tripwires we might be triggering in the vast, silent surveillance machine of the 21st century. The click of the shutter is gone, replaced by the silent tap of a screen. But the mechanism of power remains. The watcher is still watching, and the file is always open.